Chapter 12: Gender, Politeness, and Stereotypes. We have already examined the way language is used, the relationship between language, thought, and culture, and linguistic attitudes. Now, we are going to talk about women's language, which illustrates all of these concepts. This topic has brought to the table several questions. Is women's language a distinct style or register of a language? Are women more polite than men? Are there any differences in the way women and men interact? How do we signal our gender and our sexuality through our linguistic choices? How is language used to refer to women and men? What message does the language usage about women convey about their status in their community? We already know that women speak differently from men, but we will examine the way women and men use language differently and what language reveals about the way society categorizes women. Some social dialectologists suggested that women were status conscious and that this explained their use of standard speech forms. However, Robin Lakoff, an American linguist, argued that women were using language which reinforced their subordinate status. They were colluding in their own subordination by the way they spoke. Social dialect research focuses on gender differences in the areas of pronunciation and morphology, with some attention to syntactic constructions. Robin Lakoff shifted the focus of research on gender differences to syntax, semantics, and style. Lakoff suggested that the language women use and the language used about women is an indicative of women's subordinate social status in the U.S. society. She identified a number of linguistic features that are used more often by women than by men. In her opinion, these linguistic features, such as the use of standard forms and superpolite forms among others, express uncertainty and a lack of confidence. Lakoff suggested that women's speech was characterized by linguistic features such as lexical hedges or fillers, tag questions, rising intonation on declaratives, the use of empty adjectives, the use of precise color terms, intensifiers such as just and so, hypercorrect grammar, superpolite forms, avoidance of strong swear words, and emphatic stress. Many research was done over these features. However, they were methodologically unsatisfactory. They focused on form, which alone is never an adequate guide for classification, and on function and meaning, which need cautious analysis. Research missed Lakoff's fundamental point. Her list was not an arbitrary conglomeration of forms. It was unified by the fact that the forms identified were means of expressing uncertainty or tentativeness. They were unified by their functional coherence of expressing lack of confidence. Lakoff divided the internal coherence of the features into two groups. These model elements are elements that modify the force of a statement, either intensifying it with boosting devices or weakening it with hedging devices. We use hedges to avoid stating things categorically, to avoid sounding too dogmatic and sure of ourselves. Some linguistic features described by Lakoff function as politeness devices. The tag question is a syntactic device used to express uncertainty. However, tags may also express affective meaning. They may function as a facilitative or positive politeness device, providing an addressee with an easy entry into a conversation. Teachers, interviewers, hosts at parties, and in general, those in leadership roles who are responsible for the success of an interaction tend to use tags as a facilitative way. The host provides the guest with a topic of conversation. Teachers use tags to make it easy for a child to participate. Tags are also used to soften a directive or a criticism. They are also used as confrontational and coercive devices, like to strengthen the negative force of the utterance in which it occurs. Hedges are also used differently in different contexts. They mean different things according to their pronunciation, their position in the utterance, what kind of speech act are they modifying, and who is using them to whom in what context. Like tags, they are often used as politeness devices rather than as expressions of uncertainty.
We have talked about specific features of women's language. Let's talk about another aspect of gender and language, which is interaction. Despite the widespread stereotype of women as a talkative sex and proverbs which characterize women as garrulous, such as, "Women's tongues are like lamb's tails, they are never still," most of the research points the other way. In a wide range of contexts, particularly non-private ones such as television interviews, staff meetings, and conference discussions, where talking may increase your status, men dominate the talking time. So let's break down the interaction aspect in two parts. The first one is interruption. Examples of students' exchanges in coffee bars, shops, and other public places on a tape recorded carried by researchers had dramatic results. In same-gender interactions, interruptions were pretty evenly distributed between speakers. In cross-gender interactions, however, almost all the interruptions were from males. In other contexts, too, it has been found that men interrupt others more than women do. In departmental meetings and doctor-patient interactions, for instance, the pattern holds. Women got interrupted more than men, regardless of whether they were the doctors or the patients. In exchanges between parents and children, fathers did most of the interrupting and daughters were interrupted most. In other words, if you need someone to listen to you without interrupting, you know who to look for. The second part of interactions analysis is feedback. Another aspect of the picture of women as cooperative conversationalists is the evidence that women provide more encouraging feedback to their conversational partners than men do. One New Zealand study which examined the distribution of positive feedback, noises such as and in casual and relaxed interaction between young people, found that women gave over 4 times as much of this type of supportive feedback as men. American studies of informal speech, as well as talk in classrooms and under laboratory conditions, have also demonstrated that women typically provide significantly more encouraging and positive feedback to their addresses than men do. One researcher noted that women's students were also more likely than men to enlarge on and develop the ideas of a previous speaker rather than challenge them. In general, then, research on conversational interaction reveals women as cooperative conversationalists, whereas men tend to be more competitive and less supportive of others. So, why do these differences exist? In an interesting range of this research, it seems to be gender rather than occupational status, social class, or some other social factor, which most adequately accounts for the interactional patterns described. Women doctors were consistently interrupted by their patients, while male doctors did most of the interrupting in their consultations. A study of women in business organizations showed that women bosses did not dominate the interactions. Male dominated regardless of whether they were boss or subordinate. The societally subordinate position of women indicated by these patterns has more to do with gender than role or occupation. Consequently, for this data at least, women's subordinate position in a male-dominated society seems the most obvious explanatory factor. Gossip describes the kind of relaxed in-group talk that goes on between people in informal contexts. It is described as sidle talk and considered particularly characteristic of women's interaction. Its overall function is to affirm solidarity and maintain the social relationships between the women involved. Women's gossip focuses predominantly on personal experiences and personal relationships. It may include criticism of the behavior of others, but women tend to avoid criticizing people directly because this would cause discomfort. A common male reaction to this behavior is to label it two-faced, but this is to mistake its purpose, which is often to relieve feelings and reinforce shared values. The male equivalent of women's gossip is difficult to identify. In parallel situations, the topics men discuss tend to focus on things and activities, rather than personal experiences and feelings. Topics like sport, cars, and possessions turn up regularly. The focus is on information and facts rather than on feelings and reactions. Evidence of these kinds makes it easier to understand why some researchers have suggested that women and men belong to different cultural groups. It also helps explain why women and men sometimes miscommunicate.
The next topic is the linguistic construction of gender. We all know that people use linguistic resources to construct their social identities, in this case, gender identity. Gender identity is a cultural construction rather than a categorization. In other words, women adapt their speech to masculine contexts and vice versa. Men adapt theirs to feminine contexts. They both use features such as term of address and other characteristics for a cooperative discourse. One of the most obvious ways in which people construct particular kinds of social identity is through their normatives of personal experience. This means that we base our gender construction on our life experiences. Aspects such as cultural dogmas and the people around us will shape in a certain way our patterns of behavior. So, narratives are just one means of constructing particular gender identities. Every time we speak, we are either reinforcing existing norms or we are challenging them. People who do not neatly fit into the standard gender categories are particularly aware of this process. We continue with the linguistic construction of sexuality. In many societies, the discourse of gender conveys a message that heterosexuality is normal, and people who desire same-sex patterns are, in some ways, odd or deviant. Examining the relationship between language and sexuality involves considering how people construct their sexual identity, as gay, heterosexual, lesbian, or bisexual, for instance. But it also involves considering how people use language to learn about sex, talk about sex and desire, and engage in sexual activities. For instance, homosexual people may use additional linguistic features and resources on their speech to indicate their sexual orientation. However, this is not an overgeneralization. Variation in the sexuality is constructed by lesbians in Japanese bars and by Hindi-speaking lesbians in New Delhi further emphasizes the fact that there is no such phenomenon as a universal gay variety, even when researchers focus on just one language. More interesting is the suggestion that certain rhetorical strategies can index sexuality. Camp talk, for example, is widely regarded as indexing homosexuality through features such as parody, paradox, inversion of expected relationships, and linguistic playfulness. So, For example, camp talk may deliberately mix registers or refer to males as she or challenge well-established cultural values. This particular way of speaking is related to informal context. It is often amusing but also deliberately disrespectful and disturbing. For instance, in Spanish, it can be found as "Ay babosa, que loca eres." So, camp talk is a style of talk, not a dialect restricted to a particular social group with a particular sexual orientation. Linguistic resources are available to everyone to use for a range of social effects. We continue with intimate talk. Intimate talk is another area which often breaks taboos in expressing sexuality and sexual desire. Couples may address and refer to each other as animals or use babe talk to express intimacy and desire. At the other extreme, telephone sex operators serving heterosexual clients typically construct sexual identities which are completely conformist and predictable. They make extensive use of the features identified by Lakoff as women's language to convey a powerless, vulnerable, and thus, in the context of the transaction, erotic femininity. The next topic is sexist language. Sexism involves behavior which maintains social inequalities between women and men. Sexist attitudes stereotype a person according to gender rather than judging individual merits. However, sexist language encodes stereotype attitudes to women and men. In principle, then, the study of sexist language is concerned with the way language expresses both negative and positive stereotypes of both women and men. Research in this area has concentrated on the ways in which language conveys negative attitudes to women. The author presents the next question. Can language be sexist? Feminists have claimed that English is a sexist language, and we can observe why. In the semantic area, the English metaphors available to describe women include an extraordinarily high number of derogatory images compared to those used to describe men. For instance, expressions as witch, bitch, cow, and even certain words that appear to be well-intentioned, such as sugar, honey, or sweetie, which their meanings focus on women as sexual objects. English, as other languages, invisibilize women. The power of machism reflected on language, led by patriarchy. Many words reinforce a view of women as deviant, abnormal, or subordinate group. For example, in English morphology, generally takes the male form as the base form and adds a suffix to signal female: lion, lioness, count, countess, actor, actress. The male form is the unmarked form, and therefore it is or implicitly the norm. The use of an additional suffix to signal femaleness is seen as conveying the message that women are deviant or abnormal. It has also been suggested that suffixes like s and et trivialize and diminish women, and when they are referred to occupations such as authoress and poetess, carry connotations of lack of seriousness. So, the basis for claims that English renders women invisible is the use of forms such as he and man as generic forms. But its generic use is no longer acceptable to many English speakers because this meaning has become overshadowed by its masculine meaning. Others avoid it as a clumsy or misleading for the same reason. Man has become increasingly ambiguous between the generic and the masculine meaning. In a sentence such as man loves to hunt, for instance, readers might be genuinely unsure whether women are meant to be included or not. It is also clear that the word man is associated with male images, even when it is used generically. To avoid this unnecessarily generalization, the generic They, literally the word they, is by far the most widespread solution, and it has been used by well-established authors including Shakespeare, Chesterfield, George Bernard, in order to avoid those problems mentioned before. They is nowadays the most frequently heard generic pronoun in informal speech, and it is spreading to more formal contexts too, as indicated before. The women invisibilization brought as consequence the label feminization as a way to criticize the grammatical masculine forms that discriminated women by reducing their chances of being perceived as appropriate appointees to positions such as school principal and computer programmer, which were grammatical masculine in gender. However, it was a necessary change to start to break the barriers of discrimination. As conclusion, we must consider that language is not sexist by itself. Its users are responsible on how they employ it, the message they want to express, or the meaning they gave to that message. However, one thing is clear. Throughout the time, language has been used to discreetly derogate and subordinate women. Nowadays, this fact is well known by society. As a result, women sublevated against those linguistic stereotypes and needed a step to overcome discrimination. We as a community must take advantage of this change as an opportunity to eradicate discriminatory behaviors. Instead of using language as a weapon, let's try to use it as a tool to bring peace to our society. We can reach this goal. Women has demonstrated with